Hello and happy Monday to all of you, and welcome to today's video. Today's video will be focusing on a question that was posed on Instagram around relapsing during a drug or alcohol program in a rehab, and if the person is willing to undergo treatment. So they're participating in their own treatment. So one of the first things to understand about addiction is we have obviously the substance abuse addiction, which is often drug and alcohol abuse addiction. And then we have the process addictions, which are characteristically not treated in a rehab facility, but you can join support groups, psychotherapy, see a psychiatrist, etc. And that is more the gambling addictions, shopping, overeating, things like that. But there are organizations that do specialize with those process addictions. So we're going to be addressing both of those. Addictions in general are working towards an understanding as to what is the stimuli or etiology or cause, which is often multifactorial in developing a long-term addiction. So in essence, one of the two ways to look at this is that a lot of the times addiction is used to numb an emotion or to bring about an emotion. So let's first look at numbing. So numbing is often used as a short-term strategy to escape life and its stresses and its hurts and its tragedies. So it's a maladaptive coping mechanism to escape pain, hurt, anxiety, depression, all of those things, familial problems. So that numbing temporarily suppresses the feeling, and that's how it can form a full-blown addiction. Then bringing about a feeling is when someone is perhaps isolated, lonely, struggling with feelings of emptiness, boredom. Often those things are used unconsciously often or preconsciously to bring about addiction, to bring up a feeling of maybe temporary joy, fulfillment, not loneliness. Things like that is like connection. I know it's difficult to understand, but many times, for example, alcoholic will say, the bottle was my best friend, is I was alone with the bottle. And you think to yourself, but you are still alone. But it relieves that temporary feeling of isolation or disconnectedness. Okay, so in looking at that, many addiction therapists or specialists look at the etiology or cause of addiction from a biopsychosocial framework. So let's look at biological first. The biological is highly genetic, so it's heritable, which means that if you have a family member that was an alcoholic or a drug addict, there's a high propensity. It doesn't mean you will have it, but there is a propensity to develop a propensity to use drugs and alcohol to cope, maladaptively, of course, with life stresses or something that's going on. The other component to that is psychiatric. So often you'll find in addiction, like in rehab centers, that people are using drugs and alcohol to self-medicate for an undiagnosed or untreated mental disorder or mental problem. So that can be things like a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder, sometimes psychosis, sometimes ADHD. So common is that you see people that haven't been treated for all these mental disorders or conditions. They enter rehab, and once they see a psychiatrist, they level out. And so a lot of that is that one component. Then we look at the psychological. This is a big, big one. This is where your psychotherapist that is specialized and trained in addiction needs to step in to understand your childhood, your family relationships, your relationships currently in the here and now, so your next family that you're forming, but also the way you see yourself, self-esteem, body image, how you deal with shame and guilt, all of those types of things, and much, much more. I'm condensing it very much. But the psychological component is you as a human, your unconscious conflicts within yourself, and the things that drive you is to understand if you have a low self-esteem or if you have a low self-concept, is drugs or are drugs and alcohol a way to help you to function better in the world? Things like that. Then we have the social aspect of addiction. This is a huge one. There's always a systemic component to addiction. where we look at your family relationships. Codependency is massive, and enabling are a massive components of addiction, where you are so stuck in the cycle that often a huge familial and social networks are broken from trust because you're so stuck. The addiction is speaking. So the addiction will use other people, networks, family to try and feed the addiction more and more. And you always have at least one enabler, facilitator, or rescuer in the family that takes part in the addiction. They don't mean to, they want to try and help, but it's short-term help for long-term harm. Also, we're looking at family relationships from young, as perhaps we were given a lot of responsibility as a child, or there was a very bad divorce or death, or there was neglect in the household, perhaps abuse, sexual, physical, emotional, so many things that need to be looked at. And so social networking, especially in recovery, is so crucial. So now that we've briefly highlighted the biopsychosocial framework, we can look at what happens with relapse, especially if you are in a rehab facility. Is many people that are recovering, when they go through a relapse, what happens to them is they go through certain triggers or an event that activates, we call it the activating event, that triggers that whole relapse cycle, and then they feel so guilty and so ashamed, and they feel, okay, it's done, I failed, especially if there's broken trust in the community because of the things that occurred to keep the addiction going. One of the things to understand is that relapse is often, not always, but it's often a part of recovery. So relapse can be used as a mechanism to understand further the etiology, the cause that we spoke about, biopsychosocial. Is that you're always learning about what caused the addiction and what will be a trigger in future. So relapses can be a way for you to look at a blueprint as to why you tend to do these things in terms of navigating life, escaping life sometimes, bringing about an emotion, and things like that. So I had a very gifted lecturer many years ago who explained it like this, and I've always used this metaphor in my head when working with this type of problem, is that it's almost like a combination key or combination lock. So if you're putting in digits into a combination lock, so say there's 5 digits, they can all represent some triggers. So for example, if smoking was associated with perhaps alcohol, then when you smell cigarette smoke, that could be the first combination key. Then the second could be a family fight, which perhaps maybe, for example, you avoid conflict, or conflict makes you feel very anxious, or it brings about an old trauma. It could be a smell, it could be a film, it could be a feeling, so many different things. Or mounting stress, performance anxiety, all those types of things. When you put enough triggers together, you have the combination that is locked. The more you understand all those triggers together, the more in future you can stop yourself when you're starting to hit the triggers and find your relapse prevention plan, get help, get a lot of community support, which I'm going to go into briefly in a moment, and stop it before the next combination happens. So it's a beautiful way for you to look at what are the ways that I can prevent in future those combinations locking together so that it doesn't happen again. If it does happen, it is just another way for you to take out your resource book, as in putting in all your self-awareness to see, all right, so when I see that I am disappointing someone, all I want to do is escape life and go into the substance. So when you start to see that, go into your self-regulation, get your community support and things like that. Self-regulation and a problem self-regulating is highly correlated with addiction. So remember, self-regulation is the ability to process one's own emotion. We do need each other to co-regulate, but an effective ego strength throughout life is a way for you to be able to self-regulate your emotions. So not to escape emotion, but to deal with it and to understand that emotions flow through the mind and the body. The more you can understand that, the more that's very scary feelings will be able to be dealt with time, as you build that muscle, as you build the resilience to be able to deal with emotions, difficult emotions. Because remember, in addiction, especially chronic addiction, where you have, say, for example, a 9, 10, 11-year-old that took addictions from very, very young, from very hostile situations, and they never learn to self-regulate, is often you have that 9, 10, 11-year-old emotionally sitting in front of you in psychotherapy or in group therapy, because they never learned how to self-regulate. So your ability to self-regulate and to learn how to do that is crucial in recovery. Now, when you are going through a relapse in the drug or alcohol rehabilitation program or the center that you're in, it is important to utilize the support that you have right then and there, because you very seldom are going to find a group or organization where you're going to have that much understanding of what you're dealing with, because a lot of people, you will say that they don't have a lot of people in their communities that understand why they do these things. So you're going to have a lot of understanding, and you're going to have, especially in group therapy is huge with rehabilitation. You're going to see vulnerability. You're going to see a lot of people's stories, very, very similar, perhaps not the same as yours, or the intensity or less intensity or severity, but they're going to be describing things that you thought you were carrying alone. So when you see that, there's a sense of camaraderie and support and learning. Often people will say in group, I really like what you did, or you said here, because I really thought about that and I implemented in my own life. Is it shared resources? If you are not in a rehab facility yourself, it is very, very important to access a sponsor in addiction and NA, Narcotics Anonymous, or NA, or AA, sorry, so Alcoholics Anonymous. It's very, very important that you access both. So even when I take on a client and they're recovered or recovering, I always ask them to please get a sponsor and enter into support groups. Why do we do that? Is even if they're 10 years recovered, is the more we go into the childhood wound, the trauma, the problem that has caused the whole addictive strategy in a maladaptive way to cope, the more we will wake up the tendency to possibly open up that combination to relapse, because it's so ingrained in the brain to be able to jump towards that maladaptive coping strategy and to try and escape life or the feeling or emotion, or to bring about the emotion, that the more we get to the trauma, the more we have to build new adaptive strategies. However, you need outside support as well. So it is so important to, number one, get support, get as much support in the community that understands this. And also, often what I also suggest is family therapy, if it is available, because the family needs to understand their role in contributing towards the addictive cycle, in enabling codependency, facilitating, and even distancing, isolating, shaming. Is all of those things are crucial in understanding. And you might actually have to, outside of rehab, when you're out, cut off a lot of people that were enabling you, not necessarily in the family, but maybe other addicts, or people that would say, just have one drink, it won't do anything, because there's not an understanding that one drink is not the answer, or one, whatever the substance is or process addiction is not the answer. It's total abstaining. So we can look at that, and also looking at your relapse prevention plan, which is your arsenal, it's your toolbox that is going to be looking at what are the things that happen in my relapse right here, right now, that I can learn from, that so next time I don't have to go through this again. And as soon as I start to feel, okay, I've hit that combination key, I've hit this, I'm on my way to possibly relapsing, is every time you have a relapse, enter into psychotherapy or counseling with a specialist in this field to help you work through the feelings of shame and guilt. Because often shame and guilt can also bring you towards a binge, is that you'll just say, well, I really didn't do well with this, so I messed up. Let me just go balls to the wall. Let me just do it. Is rather go into a psychotherapy or counseling process, deal with it, use it as your arsenal, and try and look into a more self-aware space. Is you'll see people that have been recovered or recovering for many years, like decades, they're so self-aware, they are so self-aware that if they go, for example, to many functions, and they will say then they've got alcoholism tendencies or tendency to go towards alcohol, is they'll go say they have 2 functions in a weekend. Then they'll get a Coke Zero, a cold drink, to always have a beverage in their hand. But if there's too many triggering events, they will remove themselves, as they're so self-aware. That's the very, very important thing to understand about relapse. It is a part of recovery often. I hope this was really helpful, and I hope this gives you more food for thought. Please remember that this is just brimming the surface. Addiction, like most topics that we're going to be discussing on this channel, is very, very multifaceted. It's deep. There's a lot to it. So please don't just take this as this is all the information. There's so much information. The more you get, the better your likelihood of managing the addictive tendencies and working towards empowering yourself to find other strategies to cope with life and all the stresses that come with it. I wish you all well.